Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for tonight's Six to Celebrate tour of Bushwick. For those of you who don't know, Six to Celebrate is a targeted citywide list of preservation priorities. The purpose of the program is to provide strategic resources to neighborhood groups to help them reach their preservation goals. The six selected groups receive HTC's hands-on help on all aspects of their efforts over the course of the year and continued support in the years to come. Bushwick was a 2023 Six to Celebrate neighborhood. You can find more information about the program on the Six to Celebrate website, six2celebrate.org. Upcoming events for HTC include conference tours and programs, such as a discussion about special zoning districts, both in-person and virtual tours of Atlantic Avenue, also at Suzanne Spellen, Greenpoint, Morrisania, the Bronx River Restoration, as well as preservation school classes about stone restoration and neon glass, plus much, much more. You can learn more and register for events at our website, hdc.org. If you have any questions about programming, you can contact me at marbulu@hdc.org. I would like to thank the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, City Council, New York State Council on the Arts for supporting Six to Celebrate. And now I will hand it over to Suzanne Spellen to lead tonight's tour. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to historic Bushwick. That's where we'll be going today. And little background on me, if you don't know, I am an architectural historian and writer. I've been writing for brownstoner.com since 2009 and have a hefty repertoire of 1,200 pieces that I've written for them over the years. My area of expertise, such as it is central Brooklyn, which is Bed-Stuy, Crown Heights area. And I lived in Brooklyn for over 30 years in both neighborhoods. And now I live upstate in Troy, New York, near Albany. So I'm happy to bring you this report from sunny Troy. And we did this tour in person. We had a walking tour last fall, and it was very successful. And this tour will enable you to have much of the same experience without all the walking. So here we go. The area of the tour is roughly this part of Bushwick Avenue that I put the arrow on, with a little side trip here and there. You can see that Bushwick as a neighborhood is huge, and we've only just touched the surface of what is in Bushwick, but this is the area that really needs to be designated as some kind of a historic district soon, because gentrification and buildings being torn down and new buildings being built is just going rampant in Bushwick, especially along Bushwick Avenue, where there are no limits on how high they can build. So we want to save as much as we can. There are several individual landmarks that were landmarked in the last 5 or 6 years, but there's only one small historic district, which is part of one block. So there's so much more that needs to get done. Now, most of the buildings you're going to see on this tour were designed by this guy. His name was Theodor Engelhardt, and he was responsible for just a whole lot of buildings in what was the Eastern District, which includes Bushwick, and the eastern part of Williamsburg, and the eastern part of Stuyvesant Heights. He was American born. His parents were German immigrants, and they came to the United States in the late 1840s, when Germany was going through its own civil war, with all of these city-states vying for supremacy, and they were trying to unite them into one country. So a lot of people, thousands of Germans, left and came to the United States. Some of them went to Texas, but a great many of them came to New York and to Brooklyn. And unlike some other ethnic groups that came who were unskilled and not well off, a lot of the Germans who came here were professional people, and a lot of them were able to just pick up what they did before when they came here. So Engelhart was soon able to have quite a roster of people who were building their own fortunes here in Brooklyn. In addition to his architectural work, Engelhart was a leader in the German community, and he sat on the board of the German Savings Bank of Brooklyn. He was one of the directors of the People's Bank and a board member of the German hospital, which he also designed. In 1899, his home was on Wall Street, which is now called Aryan Place, and he's credited with designing Aryan Hall as well as its addition. And he was a high-ranking member of Aryan Hall's Society and Choir, and he became the president of the choir in 1903. And he just has just a remarkable career, hundreds and hundreds of buildings, most of them right in this general area. So I did a couple of maps here so you can see where we are. And our first tour stop will be the Ulmer Brewery. And this is on Beaver Street between Belvedere and Locust Streets. And in 1871, German immigrant William Ulmer became a partner in the Vigilius and Ulmer Continental Lager Beer Brewery. And their new brewery was on the corner of Belvedere and Beaver Streets. And by 1879, Ulmer was the sole proprietor of the brewery, and he renamed it the William Ulmer Brewery. And so there were lots of breweries in this part of Brooklyn, and all of them were making lager beer. And that became the drink of choice in New York and eventually in the entire country. Before Prohibition, Brooklyn had at least 24 breweries, and many of them were in this predominantly German Eastern District. And the Ulmer Brewery was one of the most successful. Here's the building today. Uh, so the building started out with just one building, which and designed by Theobald Engelhart, and grew to a whole complex that takes up about half of a square block. And they had buildings for each of the processes that went into beer building, everything from storage to bottling and shipping, and all the rest that it took to get from the hops and the barley to the bottles going out the door. And Engelhart designed a practical building in the Rundbogenstil Romanesque revival style. And the word Rundbogenstil, which I love to say, it means round arch. It's a particularly German form of Romanesque revival and started to be popular in Germany in the 1820s. And it eventually led to the Richardsonian Romanesque revival buildings of the 1880s that we recognize as truly Victorian. And Rundbogenstil is best identified by the use of running arches in brickwork, and this building has them aplenty. They were decorative, not functional, and he uses them all over the place, and he does it really well with corbelled brickwork everywhere. Unlike English ales, porters, and stouts, which are brewed with top yeast fermentation, lager's yeast settles to the bottom in a process called bottom fermentation. And the beer best ferments in cool temperatures, and they were originally done in underground cellars like this one, and very different process from other beer. And the name lager actually comes from the German verb lagern, which means to store. The result of this bottom fermented brew was a much lighter sparkling beer, which was introduced to America in the 1840s when the Germans started to come here in mass, and it was an instant hit. German immigrants brought their brewing skills to America with them, and they found a wide open market, and breweries began springing up all over the Eastern District, especially in the boom years after the Civil War. Now, this main brewery building is actually several buildings, and each had a specific function. So it started at the top with the brewing process, and it ended with the beer being pumped into large barrels on the ground floor, and they were subsequently stored in the buildings in these vaults. And in between the top floor and the vaults were a lot of machinery for mashing the hops and the malt and cooking it down. And there was an ice house that was provided to cool the beer when it was down here and being further fermented. So it's a great looking factory. And in 1885, Engelhart came back to design the office building for the complex, which is in the middle of the Belvedere block. This building is a delightful treasure, especially considering the factory buildings. They were utilitarian, but this one, he really put some effort into making it very, very, very attractive. And in the 20th century, so this was the office. And later on in the 20th century, William Ulmer operated his brewery until he retired in 1900, and his wife, daughters, and their husbands took over. The brewery reached peak production in 1908, but that was all done in by Prohibition in 1920. By that time, the descendants were heavily invested in real estate, and they closed the plant. They held on to this office building for their real estate business. And the building was sold in the 1920s, and all the brewery equipment was removed, and they had an elevator installed with new stairwells and other upgrades. And for the rest of the 20th century, the entire complex housed small manufacturing, such as garments, shoes, and handbag manufacturers, and was used as warehouse storage. So moving on, you have Arion Hall. And this was once the Eastern District's best and most famous German men's chorus hall. And they had this building built for their performances and as a meeting place, an assembly room, a ratskeller in the basement, and all things German. It was an important part of life in the German American community, and it was a place for men, but they would let women come to some of the events. But men were able to meet on an equal social footing. They could prepare music for concerts, they would network, and they would have a good time. And so a lot of the big beer meisters and the merchants and the bankers and everyone else and the workers could come here. And if they wanted to sing, they all had this beautiful chorus where everyone singing Schubert Lieder or something. And the street was originally called Wall Street, but they changed it to Aryan Place in honor of this hall's importance to the community. Theobald Engelhart was a member, as I said before, and he designed this building. Here it is today. The musical symbolism of the lyre, you can see that up there on the fire escape. And when singing societies became passe, the building became a catering hall. And like many buildings in a changing urban landscape, this one was boarded up until around 2003 when the building was converted into loft apartments. It's now called the Opera House Lofts. And the original entrance of the building was closed off for living space, and the entrance to the lofts is actually behind it in this wood frame building in the back there. Okay, moving down Bushwick. Our next building was St. Mark's German Evangelical Church and School. And the parish of St. Mark's Evangelical Church was established in 1868 on Evergreen Street nearby, but it soon became too small for the number of congregants. And so the new site was bought on the southwest corner of Bushwick and Jefferson Street. They purchased it in 1885 and began to build these three new buildings, a church, a school, and a rectory, and they were all dedicated together in 1892. And altogether, all three of them were designed by Theobald Engelhart. They're all brick with Nova Scotia sandstone, granite, and terracotta, and they're all in the Gothic style. And the schoolhouse was the first to be built because education of the children was seen as most important, and followed by the church. So construction began in 1890 and the cornerstone was laid in 91. And the tower had 16 bells and a clock face that let everyone in Bushwick know what time it was. In 2017, well, for a while the church was empty, the school was empty, and the it was purchased in 2017 and converted into apartments. It's now called the St. Mark's, and you can see that they cut down the steeple, probably because they're very hard to maintain, and if they fall they're dangerous. But just look at that ceiling in probably, I guess, I don't know, one of the top apartments. Get a nice chunk of ceiling that's beautiful. I like adaptive reuses like this, and it's such a better use than having them torn down to put up modern condos. By the way, this building complex is landmarked. So, moving on down the street, across from the Cook Mansion at the intersection of Bushwick, Myrtle, and Willoughby is the Freedom Triangle, which commemorates Brooklyn men who gave their lives during World War One. And the park was acquired in 1912 by the city, and it was named Freedom Triangle in 1919 after the war. And in 1921, Italian immigrant Pietro Montana sculpted this statue of the goddess Nike. And she's the Greek goddess of victory, and depicts Nike leaning forward against an olive branch. And there's a plaque on the base of the statue, and it says, "In memory of the men of the 19th Assembly District who died in the World War 1917 to 1918," and it names all 94 individuals who died from this particular district in Brooklyn. Now, that building behind the statue is the Lipsius Cook House, and it's an impressive mansion, stands out from everywhere if you're in the area, and it was constructed for Katerina Lipsius and her family in 1889. And the Lipsiuses were the prosperous owner of the Klaus Lipsius Brewing Company, one of the many brewers in Bushwick. And Klaus, her first husband, Katerina's first husband, established the brewery in 1865, but he died in 1872. So she remarried, and the brewery name was changed to the Klaus Lipsius. The Klaus she married Rudolph Lipsius, and the brewery was renamed after him. She managed the brewery herself after the death of both of her husbands, and she commissioned this house for her family in 1889. The Lipsius family sold the house in 1902 to Dr. Frederick A. Cook and his wife, and he was a successful physician and later became famous as an Arctic explorer. His story is one of those great Brooklyn stories that's got a bit of triumph and tragedy, and who knows what was going on there. But as a surgeon, he bought the house for his second wife in 1902, and he was also an explorer. He and Robert E. Peary both claimed to be the first to the North Pole in 1908. Now, popular regard is that Peary was first and Cook was second, and this began Cook's descent into disgrace and misery. He was also claiming to be the first man to reach the summit of Mount McKinley, and the controversy between Cook and Peary continued for many years, which ruined the health and reputation of both of them. When he came back from his expeditions, the city of Brooklyn, or Bushwick specifically, threw this big party for him. You had a parade. They built a triumphal arch with his picture on it, and there was bunting from all of the windows in his house. And it was just a massive occasion. And couple years later, it was all gone, and he was in disgrace. And this particular house was, of course, designed by Theobald Engelhardt. And a lot of people have always called it the Ulmer House, but it's not. The Ulmer House was across the street. And if you look at the postcard there, the house on the other side of the block in front of the house there, that one was where his house was. And that one was torn down in the 1990s. This one is landmarked and is still standing. Okay, our next set of buildings here, we had the Ulmer House, the Lipsey's Cook Mansion, I mean, and next are the Ulmer houses, continuing our journey down Bushwick Avenue. So, Ulmer, the brewer, also invested in real estate. That was something a lot of wealthy men did during that period and still do. But in this case, these people were building a lot of buildings in anticipation of and for, depending on the demographics, either workers or well-to-do people like themselves. And these particular houses were meant to be pretty upscale, and you can see they're wide and very well designed by Theobald Engelhardt, of course. And they were meant for single families with perhaps with a lot of family living in the house. And it became known as a doctor's row. And 683 and 687 on the left side were owned by at least three doctors each. And 685 belonged to Henry Eppig. He was the son of another prominent brewer named Leonard Eppig, and Henry was in the ice business. And Frederick Cook, before he lived in the mansion across the street, he lived in 687. Right next door to those houses are tenement buildings built in 1889, also designed by Theobald Engelhardt, and they were built for Dr. H.F. Prager. And tenement buildings, the definition of the word tenement doesn't always mean substandard housing for the poor. It means a building that has more than one kitchen and has multiple occupants. And so these buildings are technically tenements, and these were built for middle class renters. And most of these buildings of this type, which can be found all over Brooklyn in some way, shape, or form, were designed to have two apartments per floor with a central stairway. And most of them were just 8 units, so your apartment would go the length of the building. And so that was pretty spacious and well laid out, and with parlors in the front, moving on back to bedrooms, the bathroom, the dining room, and finally the kitchen in the back. So these particular tenements were lived in by a number of people. One of them was Edward Ricebrod, and he was a coal merchant, and he got arrested in 1909 for short measuring coal deliveries. He delivered what was supposed to be 10,000 pounds of coal, and he got paid for 10,000 pounds of coal. And when they measured it and weighed it, it was only 8,500 pounds. Oops. And another tenant in the other building was a wine merchant, and he got in a fight at Arion Hall with another man, and he pushed him, and the man died. So there was a lot of drama going on in this neighborhood even back then. Right across the street from those buildings are these two really cute little wood framed houses. They're surrounded by other wood framed houses, and all of them were designed by Theobald Engelhardt. He was very versatile. And these were designed in 1889, and they were built as an alternative to masonry houses. These were nice, wide, middle class houses. They weren't cheap fill ins. And they were very desirable, and as you can see, they still have their original porches. Now, our main part of our tour here covers all of this here, and I wanted to point out all the different stops, and it ended up looking like some kind of modern art. But there are a lot of buildings here, all between DeKalb Avenue and about Gates Avenue, and with a little couple of side trips along the way. At 797 Bushwick Avenue, you have the complex called the Little Sisters of the Poor Home for the Aged. And it was built in 1870, and it had further additions built in 1888 and 1938. It was a Victorian institutional style with sort of neo-colonial influences. And the Little Sisters of the Poor were founded in 1841 in France, and they took care of the old and the poor. And the order came to the United States in 1868. They moved into this facility in 1872, but they were able to house 150 people. But in 1876, there was a horrific fire in the men's wing, and it spread through the whole building. And you can see the newspaper illustrations of where the fire was. It was over there on the right side. And the sisters were able to get most of the people out, but they couldn't reach some of them, and some of them jumped to their deaths, and 19 people died. The It was rebuilt and new wings were added. And by 1938, it was called the St. Augustine's Home for the Aged. It was forced to close in 1970 because city building codes changed for institutions like this, and the order just couldn't afford to do all the alterations needed to bring it up to code. So they sold the building to New York City, and it became a school. It was PS 386, but now it's called Bushwick Leaders High School for Academic Excellence. And these are just some of the very colonial revival kind of details with the dormers, and it's really an interesting complex. It's amazing it survived. So, next on our tour is the Brooklyn Public Library DeKalb branch, and this is one of the Carnegie libraries. And Carnegie endowed over 54 libraries in New York City in all five boroughs. And his philosophy was that he wanted to put libraries in places where people would use them and learn and be educated, self-educating. And his philosophy for all of his library buildings was that the community had to want them and apply for them. They weren't just popped anywhere. And they're especially popular in the growing immigrant neighborhoods of the city. And the Carnegie philosophy was that one would always, as far as the architecture goes, one would always rise upstairs, which was symbolic of rising up to knowledge. You'd go into the library, and there was a big circulation desk in the middle, and there was open stacks. There were open stacks all around. Most libraries at that time, and some today still, you would go up to the desk and you would fill out a form or tell them what you wanted, and they would go into the closed stacks in the back somewhere and find your book and bring it to you. But Carnegie wanted people to be able to shop through the stacks, and this was how he learned. He had a sponsor, a rich sponsor who had a private library, and the man allowed him to just read whatever he wanted. And so he wanted his libraries to be just like that, where people could be looking for something, find something else they were interested in, and just increase their knowledge on their own. There was a committee in New York City that chose the architects for all of these libraries, but the Brooklyn Public Library has always been an independent institution, so they had their own committee that was different from the one in Manhattan and the one in Brooklyn, Bronx, and Queens. And so there was five prominent Brooklyn architects who made up this committee, and it was their job to sit and decide who was going to design the Carnegie libraries. Well, they gave them all to themselves. And this particular one was designed by William Tubby, who was on the committee. And all of the libraries are very classical looking and very beautiful, imposing, important looking buildings. Let's see. They moved here in 1908. And here's a period photograph of when it first opened, and some ladies checking out some books in the open stacks. Right across the street from the library is the Reformed Church of South Bushwick, and it was built in 1853, and it looks just like a New England church you'd find in Massachusetts or Connecticut or Vermont, and it's in this wonderful uh, Greek Revival Georgian style. It was, like I said, built in 1853, and the side wings and the uh, Sunday school and the rectory, which are on the side, were built later in 1881 to 1883. And the Reformed Church dates back to the Dutch settlements of 1654. And the land for this church was donated by two local parishioners who were in the original congregation, which consisted of 20 local farmers and their families. The adjacent street on the in front of the side there was named Himrod after Reverend John Himrod. He was the first pastor of the church. It was landmarked in 1968, one of the first Brooklyn individual buildings to be landmarked, and because they recognized its importance and its uniqueness to the city. For a long time, the parishioners didn't have any money, and which is unfortunately the case with most churches, especially in poorer neighborhoods. And as you can see in the photograph on the bottom right, the steeple was leaning. And fortunately, they were able to get that fixed. They got a paint job, and they've done a massive fundraising campaign to make sure that the building lasts another couple hundred years. And this is the side, the parish house, and just some detail of the columns in the front. Okay, moving down Flatbush, we take a little side trip and we go down Green Street and come to this lovely little frame house. These pictures were taken around Halloween, obviously, and this building was crawling with skeletons and ghosts. So it was erected in 1887, and it was somewhere else, and it was moved here in 1902, and it was designed by Theobald Engelhardt. The only thing we've seen that wasn't designed by him in this tour so far has been the library and the Reformed Church. Engelhardt designed the building, and he was responsible for moving it from its former site to this site. And it was built for a man named During, who bought the site where the building was originally, and he wanted it for a factory, so it was moved here. And in 1902, the house was purchased by Henry C. Bohack, and he was a German immigrant and the founder of the grocery store chain called H.C. Bohack and Company. And he bought the Deering house in order to construct a warehouse, and that's when the building ended up getting moved. So he commissioned Engelhardt to move it, and he replaced it with a different the site with a different building. He lived in the house until from 1902 to 1921. And this too is an individual landmark, which was landmarked in 2014. It's a lovely Italianate, classic Italianate wood framed house. It's actually quite large too. It's one of my favorite buildings in Brooklyn. This is also not on Bushwick Avenue. This is on Bleecker Street and near, oh, I forgot the name of the street. And anyway, I'll be on the map in a minute. And but Bleecker Street, it's quite a walk away from Flatbush, which we discovered when we did the walking tour. I couldn't leave the church out because it's just so magnificent. This is the Roman Catholic parish of St. Barbara, and it was established in 1893. And it was built for German immigrants, many of whom worked in the breweries in the area. And the church was named for Barbara Epping, who was the wife of local brewer Leopold Epping, who was very wealthy, wealthy enough to commission this beautiful church. And over the years, the congregation went from German Catholic to Italian, and now it's Latin Americans who displaced the original populations that came before. The ground was broken in 1907, and it was designed in the Spanish Baroque style by the firm of Helmley and Huberty. And Frank Helmley was the main architect of this building. Helmley is an incredible architect with lots of buildings all over the city. The New York chapter of the American Institute of Architects described the building as wedding cake icing, edible. The elaborate exterior has its beautiful dome, and inside you can see it's just a Baroque treasure with all kinds of columns and decorations everywhere. It's got more than 25 stained glass windows. So I had to include some detail shots because I love detail. Frank Helmley is born in Ohio. He came to New York. He studied at Cooper Union, and he received his training from the architecture department of the Brooklyn Institute of Arts and Sciences, which was the precursor of the Brooklyn Museum. And in 1890, he went to work for McKim, Mead and White, and he stayed there for at least 5 years. And that really cemented his personal style, which was very classic in a lot of ways, but he was also well read and also very observant, and he was able to design buildings in all kinds of different styles that just work. And after he left McKim, Mead and White, he set out on his own, and he had an office in Williamsburg. And one of his first buildings was the Nassau Trust Company in Williamsburg, which he designed in 1888. He also designed St. Gregory the Great Catholic Church in Crown Heights North on the corner of Brooklyn and St. John's. He designed the Prospect Park Boathouse, which you're probably very familiar with. And he also designed the Bossert Hotel on Montague Street in Brooklyn Heights, among many others. To stand in front of this church, it's awesome. I mean, there's so much to see. Okay, we're back on Bushwick Avenue, and this house is no longer there. So this is the story of this house. This was called the Pope Mansion, and it was built by a man named John Pope, who made a fortune down in Virginia, and he brought it back up here and built this house, although he hardly ever lived in it. His brother lived in it, and his brother George was a brick manufacturer, and he owned the Manhattan Enamel Brick Company, and he lived there with his sister, two sisters, and one of the sisters was a widow, and she had a couple of children. So there were four adults in the house and a couple of servants, and they rattled around in this giant house that was the envy of all the robber barons who were building around it up and down the block on this side of the street. Now George went on a spending after his brother died. The whole family got a boatload of money, and George went on this spending spree, the likes of which hadn't been seen in decades. And he gave a lot of money to the Catholic Church, and so much so that in 1902, Pope Leo the 13th made him a papal knight of the Order of St. Gregory, which at 33, he was the youngest man to be ever become a knight commander, and he was only the third American to ever get that honor. And what that gave him was a gold and red enameled cross with a picture of St. Gregory on it, suspended by crimson and yellow ribbons. And the knighthood gave him access to the Vatican should he ever be in Rome. For some wonderful reason, there are a lot of pictures of this particular interior. And George not only gave to the church, George gave to George. He started collecting everything under the sun, and you can see in that cabinet in the middle of the picture on the left, it's just chock full of bric-a-brac and tchotchkes. And he had all kinds of collections, and he had this house redone. It was already pretty fancy. He had a lot of it redone in more and more splendor. Some of the stained glass windows had his name on them, and it was just something else. The story is really fascinating, and I wrote about it. If you'd like to read it, it's on my Substack page, and it's called The Pope's Mr. Pope. And so I hope you look for it and read it. A long story short, his married sister, the widow, she was looking around, said, "He's spending all of my children's inheritance. What's going on?" She took him to court. She lost, and well, she won first and then she lost. And in the meantime, George just kept on spending until he died. In 1920, the mansion was sold to the Jewish Home for the Aged and Infirm, and they bought the house for $150,000. And they planned on investing about the same amount of money to renovate it and put in an extension in the back. And they were located in Mount Vernon, but they wanted to establish a home in Brooklyn because Brooklyn had a large Jewish population and was in need of a home for seniors. And so workmen came in and started renovating. And to everyone's surprise, they found that the elaborate chandeliers were 22 karat gold and they were worth a lot of money. And that was certainly a surprise for the owners. And the surviving sisters were not aware of that either. The workmen got another surprise when they opened what looked like a closet in the dining room, and they found a massive vault where George must have kept his most valuable treasures. And they also opened another door and found George's beloved pipe organ, which was valued at $10,000. So the Pope Mansion served the Hebrew home until the 1950s, when they decided that the house was too small and they needed a modern, larger facility. And so the mansion that John Pope built for his siblings, the mansion that was home to George Pope and his collections and his pipe organ and his niece and his nephew and a white peacock that he had for a while, was all replaced by a 5-story modern style institutional building. And that is what is there today. It's funny that the icon for a sacred place is a cross. This is a Jewish home. Moving down the street, only a block away from this, the other houses is the Gustav Dorchuk house. And this is on the corner on Bushwick Avenue. It's one of the finest brewers mansions surviving in Bushwick today. It's this huge granite and brick pile, and it was built to impress. Dorchuk was a brewer, and he lived here with his wife Julia, and he owned the North American Brewery, which was at Green and Wilson over on a different part of Bushwick, until it was taken over by Schaefer in 1946, and then it closed in 1948. There's so much house here, all kinds of details. And yes, Theobald Engelhardt designed this. By the way, he did not design the house, the Pope Mansion. One of the few he did not design. Okay, right across from the Dorchuk mansion was this one. This was the Lindemann house. Linden was also a brewer, and he all the brewers built giant mansions on Bushwick. It was sort of like the Fifth Avenue of Bushwick in the late 1800s. And Lindemann was an officer in the Brooklyn German Republican Club, and he was very important in the community. The house passed through many owners, and towards the end of the 20th century, well, towards the end of the 2010s, someone bought it and spent a lot of money messing it up. It used to have shingles and all kinds of wooden decorations and ornamentation and stained glass, and they took it all off and they covered the whole thing in stucco. But at this point, somebody wanted to buy it and tear it down. And at the meeting of the Bushwick community, well, the Bushwick had a plan for landmark. Bushwick had a plan for landmarking this whole area, and it was initiated by council members Antonio Reynoso and Rafael Espinal, and it had a lot of input from local nonprofits and local people, and a big study was done by the Columbia grad students in historic preservation, and they did all this work showing how all of this area should be landmarked, but LPC was not interested, and this particular house in particular, they rejected it. They rejected the plan, and they rejected some kind of individual landmark status for the house because they said it had been changed too much by the stuccoing and everything, and there wasn't enough original detail. The community was devastated, and but the house was torn down anyway, and this building in the photograph was built in its place. And the architect's statement that it replaced a beloved Victorian home and prompted local activists and community leaders to advocate for historical preservation. But this building that they designed aims to integrate naturally with the neighborhood while simultaneously enhancing the area's modernity. I don't think so, but that's what's there now. Okay, across the street from that is the Louis Bossert House, and a lot of the original ornament is gone from that house, but it was designed by Theobald Engelhardt, and Louis Bossert was a very wealthy and successful lumber and millwork magnate. He built homes, and this was one of his ads for his blue ribbon Bossert homes over there on the left there, and he was very active in the community. And he would go on to build the Bossert Hotel in 1909, which was one of Brooklyn's finest hotels on Montague Street. And it was known as the Waldorf Astoria of Brooklyn and was the unofficial home of the Dodgers. And later, after Bossert died and the family sold the house, it became the headquarters of the Aryan Singing Society when they left the Aryan Hall because it was too expensive to keep up. They moved over here, and for many years it was a very popular place, and it became a community institution. Now it is back being a private home, and that's the side of it. It's a pretty big house. It's now more than one single family home. It's multiple families now. Now, directly next door to the home were these two houses, and they were the work of an architect named Walter B. Wills, and he was a local architect, and his buildings show up between the 1890s to the 1920s. And when this was an era time when Brooklyn was becoming more and more middle class and working class, and the beer barons and the industrial giants were moving out and moving on to Long Island or Park Avenue or wherever. And so the houses and the architecture changed with the times. And so you'll notice that this particular set of houses was really simpler than some of the others, but it's had garages in the back. So this was an indication that this was a middle class home, and for someone who could afford to have a car back when cars were not easily obtainable by just anyone. So lovely golden brick houses, and unfortunately not being landmarked. The one on the right is now gone, and it is being replaced by this multi-story condo box. Another reason why the people in this neighborhood are so desperate to get something landmarked before everything is gone. But they can't take this one. This is landmarked as an individual landmark in 2017. And this is the Peter Huberty House. It was designed in 1900 in the colonial revival style for Peter and Rosa Huberty. And this is considered one of the best houses remaining on this particular street. And it was designed by the Huberty's eldest son, Ulrich, who was later in partnership with Frank Helmley, and who designed St. Barbara's. So there's a connection there as well. Unfortunately, Ulrich died very early. His life was cut short by typhoid fever, and he died at 33. The house has bricks in Flemish bond, and it's got coins on the corners and a lovely hipped roof with the dormers, and there's a widow's walk up there too. It was for sale in the last 5 years, so here are a couple of interior photographs. And Peter Huberty was a German immigrant. He was a teacher, he was a lawyer, and he was active in the Democratic Party, and he was the county clerk in 1899. He belonged to the Aryan Singing Society as well. And Ulrich, who designed this, had an older brother named Henry, and Henry was president of Werner and Hubert, which was a construction company. And Ulrich, aside from his partnership with Frank Helmley, also designed the Grand Prospect Hall, which is now gone and replaced by an apartment building. So quite a legacy in that particular home. Right next door is this lovely little house. I just I don't know who lived in it. Nobody really stands out, but it's just a wonderful Queen Anne confection of dormers and bays and oriels and all kinds of stuff. Sort of a turret there. And this was designed by Frank Keith Irving, and Irving appears often on in throughout Brooklyn designing buildings, and most of them are pretty good. This is the 1940s tax photo of that house, and you can see how much it's been changed. It had more windows on the little oriel up there on the right. It had cedar shakes on the top and clapboard in the middle, and it was just a delightful home with stained glass in the windows and everything. We're lucky it survived, but it's too bad it doesn't look like this still. Now, Bushwick Avenue is known as the Street of Churches, and in addition to the ones that I've shown already, these are all the churches that are on Bushwick Avenue between the streets that have been looking at. There's a lot of churches, and they're all huge. So the only one that is not there anymore is the one in the middle on the top, the golden brick one. That one was torn down for an apartment building. All kinds of denominations. Two of them are Episcopalian. There's a Baptist and Methodist. Just a multitude of denominations here on Bushwick. Okay, this is the only historic district in Bushwick. It's part of one block of Linden Street, and it includes the houses that you see here, this row of wonderful Queen Anne row houses, and some houses across the street that were designed by someone else or two other people. And I love these houses. The first time I ever went to Bushwick, I was lucky enough to be near enough this street to see these houses, and I took a bazillion photographs, and I just love them because I love ornament, and this row has some of the most incredible ornament I've ever seen on middle class row housing. Everything is just excellent, and the scale is right. It matches the other buildings. They're built around the same time, and so it's just a wonderful house. It's got the dogleg stoops, which you don't see much in Bushwick, and they're very much influenced by the British arts and crafts movement, and just this love of beauty, ornament for beauty's sake. None of that stuff is in any way uh, structural, but it's just gorgeous. Here's some more photographs with some detail, and the house on the corner of the row is this big Queen Anne confection with just more ornamentation and more widow's walk and all kinds of stuff going on there with dormers, etc. And the buildings were commissioned by a developer named Samuel Meeker in 1888, and there are 10 houses, and The Meeker family estate held on to them until 1944 when they sold them to other people. Another shot of the most of the row. And these were also designed by the guy who did the eclectic little Queen Anne that I just showed you, Frank Irving. And Frank Irving was very talented. He came up with some wonderful buildings, and these are his masterpieces. But his life was a total mess. In 1889, he got arrested for fraud, for taking money under false pretenses for a fictitious project. And the project involved being contacted by this guy who said he was a minister and wanted to build the largest temple to God that was in the city, and he wanted Frank to design it. So Frank designed this building. It was this huge tower with a cross on top and the whole bit, and the money for it never came, and it turned out to be a total con. But Frank Irving had been distributing the building rights and other things to other workers, and he ended up owing people money, and he didn't have any because there was no money coming from the guy who conned him, and he ended up in jail. And so after that, he kind of diddled around with a few more buildings, and he eventually left Brooklyn and he moved to New Jersey, and he had a new career and a new life, and he designed a firehouse in Passaic. And but he's better known in New Jersey for working with batteries and electricity, and he was the holder of several patents obtained in 1899 and 1900 for improvements in battery designs. But by 1910, he was indicted for practicing medicine without a license, and he was experimenting with all of his batteries and electrotherapy machines, and he was trying to figure out new treatments for TB, but he didn't have a license to do that, and so he was calling himself a doctor, and he died at the age of 37, and just a tragic life in so many ways, but he left us this wonderful group of buildings. Okay, moving down on Bushwick, we're come to the Ridgewood Lodge 710 Masonic Temple. This was landmarked as well as an individual landmark, built in 1909, 1919, 1920. Oops. I forgot to write notes on this. Anyway, the building was built for the Masons and was very well known in Brooklyn and got written up in the papers a lot. Long story short, the Masons left in the 70s, and it became a community center for a while. It became a place where they had big parties for a while, very short while, and it was sold, and now it is rebranded as apartments and is doing well as expensive apartments. Okay, lastly on our trip here, we're going to go to the corner of Gates Avenue and Bushwick Avenue. And in the late 1800s, you would have found this building. This was the Eastern District Turnverein, which was a German fitness club. It was established by Frederick Ludwig Jahn, and he was way back in the Napoleonic Wars in the early 1800s. He was a soldier, and he was disgusted with how the Germans failed to defeat Napoleon, and he said they were all soft and not manly at all. And so he established this program of gymnastics and physical fitness, and he's known as the father of modern gymnastics. Jan invented the balance beam, the horizontal and parallel bars, and the vaulting horse. And he founded Turnverein clubs all across Germany. And the motto for the club was Frisch, fromm, fröhlich, frei, which means hearty, pious, cheerful, and free. And he was jailed for his nationalistic activities in the 1820s. He didn't like Catholics, he didn't like Jews, he didn't like other Germans, and so they tossed him in jail. And by the time he got up in the 1840s, the clubs had been taken away from him and had moved on, and no more Frederick Jahn. So membership was expanded to include people not in the gymnastics program, and they were called Friends of the Turin, and they had created libraries and reading rooms and lectures. And when German immigrants came to America, they brought the clubs with them. And American Turnvereins were a cultural sanctuary that preserved traditional German customs, language, and celebrations. And they also encouraged a new full life in America, and they sponsored English language classes and citizenship classes. And the Turnverein halls usually had a restaurant or a beer hall. And by the Civil War in 1861, the Turners, as they were now called, had firmly established themselves in America. There were several Turnverein chapters. One of them was down on Atlantic Avenue in downtown Brooklyn. It's the building where the Horseman Antiques has been for generations. And this one, the Eastern District Turnverein, was originally in another building further down on Bushwick in the other direction. And this building replaced it. Uh, During the Civil War, the other Turnverein building was a sanctuary for escaping African Americans who were escaping the draft riots, and they made it across to Brooklyn and into Williamsburg, and the Turners opened their doors and protected them from mobs of people who were killing Black people right and left during the draft riots. The height of the Turner movement, well, during the Civil War, there were Turner rifles. They were special regiments of sharpshooters, all members of the Turners, and they were in some very important battles, and they were also protecting the president at the time. And the height of the Turner movement was in 1894, when there were 317 societies in the United States with over 40,000 members. And in Brooklyn, there were at least 5 chapters listed in the Brooklyn Directory. This was the largest one, and it was founded in 1853. And this was, let's see, nope. The building, well, let me go back a sec. The building was built around a mansion called the Tuttle Mansion. You can see it in the center of this amalgamation of different buildings. And by the early 1900s, the Tuttle Mansion was way too small, and so they wanted to expand. And we're not sure who the architect was of the expansions. Could have been Engelhart, don't know. But they are all that remain today. This was the extension on the left, which goes around the corner, and this is now being used by a church. And the Tuttle Mansion is gone, but they built a sort of taxpayer building church in the middle there. And let's see, that's it for our tour. So if you have any questions, please take them now. Hopefully I can answer them, and I hope you enjoyed it. And next year, maybe there'll be an actual walking tour again. So thanks.
Thank you, Suzanne. That was great. Yes, if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat. We do have 2. Why did Cook fall into disgrace several years after he returned from his explorations? Did you address that?
Yeah, he told everyone that he went to the North Pole first, and then Peary, actually Henson, black man, was the first man on the North Pole. He was with with Peary, and there was this big argument who came first, and unfortunately Peary had more proof, and so he was just disgraced. Everybody thought he was a liar and an opportunist, which was really too bad because he was an important explorer in his own right.
He also
Anybody?
asked, was Bushwick ever a neighborhood with many Jewish people?
Um, Later, but not as much as Williamsburg.
Someone else just said, wonderful detail in history, very enjoyable, makes me want to stroll by and see it all in person. Please do. The neighborhood is beautiful. This virtual tour is great, but yes, the in-person tours are fantastic. And as with all of our Six to Celebrate, we will eventually be publishing a self-guided walking tour brochure. So stay, tuned at HGC. We will announce it when they are ready. Do we have
So
any other questions?
last chance. Okay, then.
Well, as it is after 7 and I don't see any other, I think that is good. Thank you very much. Once again, this was great.
Thank
As I
you.
mentioned, this was recorded and will be posted to our YouTube channel. You can also find many of our other walking tours as well as our preservation school classes on our YouTube channel and all of our conference panels. So please do check that out if you've missed anything or if you want to rewatch. And thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Suzanne, and
You're
I'll see you
welcome.
all soon.
Yep. Good night, everyone.
Have a good night.